August 1942. German forces were advancing deep into the Soviet Union. After the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, Adolf Hitler turned his attention toward southern Russia. The German objective was enormous. They wanted to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut important Soviet supply routes. But one city would become the center of the campaign: Stalingrad. Located on the Volga River, the city was an important industrial and transportation center. Its name also carried enormous political symbolism. It was named after Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be both a military and psychological victory. For Stalin, losing the city would be unacceptable. The German Sixth Army advanced toward Stalingrad. By late summer, German aircraft began bombing the city. Buildings were destroyed. Factories were damaged. Smoke covered the skyline. Thousands of civilians were caught in the fighting. Yet the bombing did not destroy Soviet resistance. Instead, the ruins would become a battlefield. German troops entered the city. At first, they expected to capture it quickly. But Stalingrad was unlike the open battlefields where German armored formations had previously achieved rapid breakthroughs. The city offered endless defensive positions: factories, apartment blocks, railway stations, basements, warehouses, ruined buildings. Every structure could become a fortress. Soviet soldiers fought for individual streets and buildings. Sometimes they controlled one floor while German troops controlled another. The battle became extremely close. Tanks could not always maneuver effectively through the ruins. Artillery became difficult to use without risking friendly forces. Infantry became the decisive element. Soviet soldiers were ordered to hold the city. Reinforcements crossed the Volga River under German fire. Boats moved across the river carrying soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. The Volga became a lifeline. If the Germans captured the riverbank completely, Soviet forces inside Stalingrad could be cut off. The Soviet defenders therefore fought desperately. One of the most famous locations was the Red October factory. Another was the Barikadi factory. The giant industrial complexes became battlefields. Workers and soldiers fought among machinery and destroyed buildings. German troops captured large sections of the city. But they could not eliminate Soviet resistance. Every time the Germans believed the city was nearly defeated, Soviet forces found another position from which to continue fighting. The battle became a war of exhaustion. German commanders continued pushing forward. Hitler demanded victory. But the deeper German forces moved into the city, the more difficult their position became. The German army had another problem. Its flanks outside Stalingrad were protected by weaker Axis forces, including Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. These forces had fewer anti-tank weapons and were less capable of resisting a massive Soviet armored attack. The Soviet High Command saw an opportunity. Instead of continuing to attack German forces directly inside Stalingrad, Soviet commanders planned a massive operation against the German flanks. The operation was called Uranus. Its objective was simple: break through the weaker Axis positions north and south of Stalingrad. Then surround the German Sixth Army. The plan was carefully prepared. Soviet forces gathered enormous numbers of troops, tanks, and artillery. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet offensive began north of Stalingrad. Artillery opened fire. Then Soviet troops attacked. Romanian defenses were overwhelmed. Soviet armored forces broke through. The following day, another Soviet attack began south of the city. The two Soviet forces moved toward each other. German commanders initially struggled to understand what was happening. Then the reality became clear. The Sixth Army was being surrounded. On November 23rd, Soviet forces met near Kalach. The German forces inside Stalingrad were trapped. Around 250,000 Axis soldiers were caught inside the encirclement. Hitler refused to allow the Sixth Army to retreat. He ordered the troops to remain in Stalingrad. German leaders hoped supplies could be delivered by air. The Luftwaffe promised to maintain an air bridge. But the task was impossible on the scale required. The surrounded army needed enormous quantities of food, ammunition and fuel. German aircraft could not deliver enough supplies. Winter arrived. Temperatures fell. Soldiers suffered from hunger and cold. Medical supplies became scarce. The wounded filled overcrowded facilities. German troops were trapped in ruins with little chance of escape. Outside the pocket, Soviet forces strengthened their positions. The Red Army continued tightening the encirclement. German attempts to break through failed. An operation known as Winter Storm was launched in December. German forces tried to reach the trapped Sixth Army. But they could not break the Soviet defenses. The distance between the relief forces and the trapped troops remained too great. Hitler still refused to permit a breakout. The situation became increasingly desperate. The German soldiers inside Stalingrad were running out of everything. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, clothing, even basic supplies. The Luftwaffe could no longer sustain them. Soviet forces continued attacking. By January 1943, the German position had collapsed into a much smaller area. The Soviet army launched another major offensive. German defenses were pushed backward. The city became even more destroyed. On January 31st, German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. He had been promoted to Field Marshal shortly before his surrender. Hitler had expected him to die rather than surrender. But Paulus chose to capitulate. Other German units continued fighting for several more days. On February 2, 1943, the remaining German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. The battle was over. But its consequences were enormous. The German Sixth Army had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. Around 90,000 German and Axis soldiers eventually became prisoners after the final surrender. Many of those prisoners would never return home. The Soviet victory shocked Germany. For the first time, an entire major German field army had been surrounded and destroyed. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Stalingrad became a turning point. The war was not immediately won by the Soviet Union. Germany remained extremely dangerous. But the strategic momentum had changed. After Stalingrad, the Red Army increasingly began pushing westward. German forces were forced to fight defensive battles. The Soviet victory also had enormous psychological importance. For Soviet citizens, Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance. The city had suffered enormous destruction, but its defenders had refused to surrender. The battle demonstrated the importance of urban warfare. In Stalingrad, buildings became defensive positions. Factories became fortresses. Ruins became shelters. Basements became command posts. Every meter of ground could become the scene of a fight. German tanks that were extremely effective in open terrain became less useful in narrow streets. Soviet infantry learned to operate in small groups. They moved through buildings. They attacked from unexpected directions. They used ruins to hide from German aircraft and artillery. The battlefield became unpredictable. One of the most famous defensive positions was Pavlov's house. A small group of Soviet soldiers held a fortified building for weeks. The position became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Another famous location was Mamayev Kurgan. This large hill dominated parts of the city. Control of the hill was extremely important because it provided a commanding view of the surrounding area. The hill changed hands several times during the fighting. The battle around it was incredibly intense. The Volga River also played a central role. Soviet reinforcements had to cross the river under fire. Boats traveled at night. Soldiers arrived directly into the battlefield. Some never reached the shore. Yet the flow of reinforcements continued. The Soviet ability to maintain the bridgehead inside the city was essential. Without the Volga, the defenders might have been completely cut off. The battle also revealed serious problems in German strategy. Hitler had divided German forces between multiple objectives. The German army attempted to advance toward the Caucasus while simultaneously fighting for Stalingrad. This stretched supply lines. Fuel became increasingly important. The further German forces advanced, the harder it became to supply them. The Soviet counteroffensive exploited those weaknesses. The German army had entered the city expecting victory. Instead, it became trapped. The battle also demonstrated the dangers of political interference in military decisions. Hitler refused repeated requests to withdraw. German commanders believed the army should break out before the encirclement became complete. But Hitler insisted that Stalingrad be held. By the time permission might have made a difference, the situation had become almost impossible to reverse. The Soviet victory came at a terrible cost. The Red Army suffered enormous casualties. Civilians suffered tremendously. The city was almost completely destroyed. Millions of lives across the wider campaign were affected. Stalingrad was not simply a military victory. It was a human catastrophe. The battle destroyed homes, factories, and entire neighborhoods. People survived in cellars and ruins. Families were separated. Many civilians were unable to escape before the fighting. The city became a landscape of destruction. Yet the Soviet defenders continued fighting. By February 1943, the German army was defeated in Stalingrad. The victory gave the Soviet Union a powerful psychological advantage. It showed that Germany could be defeated. It also encouraged Soviet commanders to launch further offensives. The Red Army continued advancing. German forces retreated toward the west. The Eastern Front had entered a new phase. There would still be major German attacks. The Battle of Kursk would come later in 1943. But after Stalingrad, Germany would never again achieve the same strategic position in the Soviet Union. The road from Stalingrad eventually led toward Berlin. The Red Army would fight across Ukraine. It would liberate Belarus. It would move into Poland. It would enter Germany. And in 1945, Soviet soldiers would fight in Berlin. But that journey began with battles like Stalingrad. The battle became one of the most famous examples of urban warfare in military history. It showed how a city could absorb an enormous army and transform a mobile war into a brutal struggle for individual buildings. It also demonstrated how strategy and logistics could decide the outcome of a battle. The German army had powerful tanks, aircraft, and experienced soldiers. But once surrounded, those advantages became much less important. An army needs food. It needs ammunition. It needs fuel. It needs medical supplies. Without those things, even a powerful military force can collapse. That was the lesson of Stalingrad. The Germans had entered the city with confidence. They left with the loss of an entire army. The Soviet victory also had international consequences. Germany's allies became increasingly concerned about the future. The confidence of the Axis alliance was weakened. The Soviet Union gained enormous prestige among the Allies. Stalingrad became a symbol of the Allied struggle against Nazi Germany. In later years, the city would be remembered as one of the places where the direction of World War II changed. The ruins of Stalingrad eventually became a monument to those who fought and died there. The city was rebuilt. Today, Volgograd stands where Stalingrad once fought for survival. Memorials preserve the memory of the battle. Mamayev Kurgan became one of the most important memorial sites of the war. The enormous Motherland Call statue overlooks the city. It represents the scale of the sacrifice made during the battle. Stalingrad remains a reminder of how destructive war can become. A city that once contained factories, homes, and families became a battlefield. Thousands of soldiers fought among ruins. Civilians struggled to survive. And an entire German army disappeared. The battle lasted for months. Its consequences lasted for decades. Stalingrad did not end World War II. But it changed the direction of the war. Germany had failed to capture the city. The Sixth Army had been destroyed. The Soviet Union had seized the strategic initiative. From that point onward, the Red Army increasingly moved west. The final destination would be Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad therefore stands as one of the most important turning points in modern military history. It was a battle of extraordinary scale, a battle of endurance, a battle fought street by street, building by building and sometimes room by room. And when it ended in February 1943, the world knew that Nazi Germany could be defeated.